Have you ever truly felt lost? Everything around you seems familiar, yet at the same time, it feels strangely foreign? We thought we were just going to have a fun camping night, until we realized the forest had decided not to let us go. Before we start the story, let me know in the comments where you're from, and when you're watching this, don't forget to like the video and subscribe. My name is Owen. I'm 27 years old. I love camping, but I always approach nature with caution. Some forests are not silent. This story happened 3 years ago. To this day, I still can't tell what was real and what was just a dream. I planned a weekend camping trip with my friends Ethan and Mia. We wanted to be far from the city, in an isolated area. Ethan's old acquaintance suggested a place, a bit outside of town, where not many people went. There used to be a ranger's cabin, but it's abandoned now, he said. This piece of information made me a bit uneasy, but we were excited for the adventure. After all, these kinds of things always caught our interest. Friday night. After a long journey through the forest road, we finally arrived at the campsite, and by the time we got there, the sun was setting. The place was beautiful but strange. There were so many old trees around, and we couldn't hear any bird sounds. Shouldn't there be bird sounds in a forest? But as I said, we heard nothing. We set up our tents, started a fire. Everything seemed normal. We ate dinner and had some snacks afterward. Mia opened a bottle of wine, and Ethan began telling a camping story. At that moment, I noticed something faint. Between the trees, it was like something was there. A shadow. But it wasn't moving. At first, we thought it was just the shadow of a tree, but then I asked, "Is there something over there?" Ethan and Mia looked. "It's just a tree," they said. As the night went on, a sense of unease grew inside me. It felt like we were being watched. Midnight. I couldn't sleep. The embers of the fire were still glowing with a faint light. Ethan and Mia had already fallen asleep. Then, I heard a strange sound. A muffled whisper coming from between the trees. It was as if several people were talking very slowly at the same time. My skin crawled. I slowly sat up and looked in the direction of the sound. There was no one there. But in the trees, there was a dark void, almost like a gap. It felt like someone was standing there, but my eyes couldn't see. A strange fear washed over me in that moment. I quickly zipped up the tent and shut my eyes. Saturday morning. When the sun rose, I tried to logically explain the fear from the night before. While preparing breakfast, Mia noticed something that had fallen to the ground. "Is this yours?" she said. Ethan and I looked. On the ground was a note we hadn't seen the night before. An old, yellowed piece of paper. There was only one sentence written on it. "Don't stay too long." Ethan laughed and said, "Someone must have camped here and left it as a joke." But a sense of unease was growing inside me. I started to think that this note wasn't really a joke because something was definitely off here, and I didn't want to stay any longer. But for some strange reason, I also refused to leave. It was as if something was forcing me to stay. That day, we had fun, laughed, went for walks, and it was really beautiful. We started to enjoy the camp. When evening came, we made dinner, ate the same food as the night before, and went to sleep. Then, around 2 a.m., just as I was falling asleep, I heard footsteps. Very clear. Someone, or something, was walking around our tent. But there was something strange. The footsteps weren't fading away. They were just circling the tent. Mia suddenly whispered, "Owen, someone's outside." I held my breath. Ethan shifted, reached for the tent zipper. "Wait," I whispered. But he didn't listen. He unzipped the tent and rushed out. Then, nothing happened. He didn't shout. He didn't run. We stepped outside and looked at him. Ethan was standing by the campfire, frozen like a statue. "What happened?" I asked. He slowly turned his head towards us, but the expression on his face was not a human expression. His eyes were empty, as if he was feeling nothing. Then, he smiled, but it wasn't a normal smile. It was an exaggerated, stretched, wide grin. Mia took a step back. Ethan didn't say a word. Then softly he said, "Let's stay here." But his voice didn't sound like Ethan's anymore. At that moment, I made my decision. I grabbed Mia's hand and whispered to her, "Run." Suddenly, we left our tents and belongings behind and ran into the darkness. I could hear Ethan walking behind us, but he wasn't running. He was only coming at a slow pace. But that wasn't Ethan. We felt like we were lost in the forest. But eventually, we came across a trail. And then, suddenly, the footsteps stopped. When we looked behind us, Ethan was no longer there. We were lost in the forest until morning. Eventually, we reached a main road, and a car picked us up. We went to the police, but they couldn't find Ethan at the campsite. Later, we found out that that area wasn't even on any maps. There was no record of it. No one ever saw Ethan again. But sometimes, at night, while I'm walking in the woods, I feel like someone is walking slowly behind me, and someone whispers in my ear, "Let's stay here." My name is Daniel. I am 28 years old, and I have always loved being in nature. One evening after work, I decided to go camping with my friends, thinking it would just be a fun weekend. However, the night we spent in the forest left an unforgettable mark on my mind. We found a hidden camping spot online, a place deep in nature that wasn't well known. Even old maps didn't mention its name. It was once used as a hunter's camp, but had been abandoned for years. It was a few hours away from town, and the route was difficult. But we followed our adventurous spirit. This adventure, however, became our biggest regret. When we arrived, there was a strange stillness in the air. No bird sounds, no rustling leaves, just an unsettling silence. We thought it was just our exhaustion and the natural quiet of the forest. We set up our tents, lit the fire, and got ready for the night. As the night deepened, we began to hear a strange humming sound from the forest. At first, we thought it was the wind, but it was too rhythmic. It stopped for a moment and then started again. At some point, we decided to follow the sound. Grabbing our flashlights, we ventured into the woods. After walking for about 15 minutes, we noticed something beneath a large tree. The soil looked freshly dug. On top of it lay an old, rusty hunting knife. There were strange symbols carved into it. Jack mumbled, "This must be really old," but none of us dared to touch it. Just as we were about to head back, we heard a strange rustling sound from the direction of our campsite. It was as if someone was walking around our tents. We quickly started making our way back, but we lost our sense of direction in the forest. Our phone maps were open, but the GPS wasn't working properly. After a while, we managed to find our way back to the campsite, but something was off. Our tents looked different. Our belongings were scattered, as if someone had rummaged through everything. The fire was still burning, but there was no one else around. At that moment, a whisper came from the other side of the campsite. It was so faint that we thought we had imagined it. But then it became clear, "You shouldn't be here." My whole body froze. My friends had heard it too, but no one said a word. The silence was so heavy that we could hear our own breathing. Then, something moved past the tent. I don't know if it was human or animal, but I saw its silhouette. Tall, skinny, hunched over. But its movements weren't human. I turned to my friends and said, "We need to leave. Now." Without wasting time packing, we turned on our flashlights and started heading down the trail. But no matter how far we walked, we couldn't find a way out. The paths twisted and turned, as if the forest itself was trying to keep us trapped. Eventually, we reached a clearing. There, an old, abandoned cabin stood. Its wooden door creaked slightly in the wind. That's when we realized we had never seen this place before. It wasn't on any map. Just as we were about to turn back, we heard a deep breathing sound from inside the cabin. Then the door slowly creaked open on its own. We ran. With all our strength, we sprinted through the forest. We didn't look at each other. We didn't look back. Our feet sank into the mud. Branches scratched our faces. But nothing was worse than seeing what was inside that cabin. Somehow, we made it to the main road. When we got into our cars, we were still trembling. No one spoke. We just started the engine and drove away from that cursed place. After that night, we found no records of the place. Not even a mention on any map. Why was that cabin there? And more importantly, what was in the forest with us that night? I don't know. And maybe I never want to know. My name is Jack. I am 29 years old. I've always loved camping, being immersed in nature, sleeping peacefully in a tent at night, and waking up in the deep silence of the forest in the morning. But that day is hard to explain. I can never forget that night, my missing friend, and that campsite. For a weekend trip, we formed a group of 4. Me, Alex, Matt, and Lily. Lily was quite an adventurous friend of mine, always suggesting new places for us to explore. This time, she told us about an old, abandoned campsite outside the town. It's great, peaceful, immersed in nature, she said. Many people camp there, but it's abandoned now. You'll truly be all alone. At first, we hesitated a bit, but eventually, we got excited. We all wanted to be closer to nature. The next day, we packed our cars and hit the road. It took more than an hour to reach the campsite, passing through forested roads, far from the city. Along the way, we saw a few abandoned houses and old structures. It seemed a bit odd to us, but Lily's comment, "There are stories here for sure. Old places are always more mysterious," relaxed us. We finally reached the campsite after the long journey. It was quite isolated, and we could easily hear the sounds of nature around us. The trees surrounding us were deep and ancient. Each one seemed like it had been standing there for centuries. The air was chilly, but the wind was gently blowing. We set up our tents, lit our fire, and began preparing our food. Everything seemed normal, but something felt off. It was too quiet. There were no bird sounds at all. After all, in the forest, you usually hear birds in the early morning or evening, but here, there was no sound. It was very strange. After setting up the tents, we had our dinner. Lily decided to stay outside, enjoying the night, drinking wine with everyone, and telling stories. Everything seemed normal at that point. But as the night went on, I started noticing something strange. Especially around 10 p.m., I began to feel as though we were being watched. There was no one around us, but we were so isolated that we could only hear the sounds of the forest. I noticed something moving between the trees. I looked forward and thought to myself, maybe I'm just imagining this. At that moment, Lily said, "Jack, look at that," and pointed toward a shadow between the farthest trees. The shadow seemed to move for a second. I quickly turned my eyes toward it, but there was nothing. I stared for a few seconds, but neither the shadow nor anything else was there. It's just too dark here, I thought, but Lily was still staring intently. As the night progressed, we started hearing strange sounds. Was it the wind or an animal? The sounds were so clear that none of us had the courage to look outside. Then Matt asked, "What's going on? Didn't you hear that noise?" The strange hum, almost like a whisper, seemed like someone was talking, but the sounds were distant and muffled. Mia immediately laughed, saying, "You're being like a ghost," but I could see fear in her eyes. "There's something here," I said, but no one paid attention. Everyone laughed it off, but I couldn't shake the feeling. I still couldn't figure out where those strange sounds were coming from. At midnight, the whispering sounds grew louder. Suddenly, as if from the depths of the forest, a scream echoed through the air. My whole body froze. "What was that?" I asked, but no one could answer. Everyone immediately fell silent, and our eyes locked in the darkness. That's when I noticed something strange. At the base of the largest tree near the tent, I saw something glowing, but I had no idea what it was. Lily immediately stood up and said, "I'm going outside to check. It's too dark and weird here." At that moment, I didn't want Lily to go, but then she changed her mind and disappeared into the forest. An hour passed, and she still hadn't returned. Matt and I, terrified, left the tent and began searching for her. But as we ventured deeper into the forest, we noticed something strange. Lily's footprints had suddenly disappeared. The footprints had been replaced by other marks. Then we heard a whisper, but this time it was much closer. Matt took a step back, his face full of fear as he looked at me. "Where did Lily go?" he asked. Just then, something like a shadow rushed past us, vanishing in front of our eyes. We froze in fear. "Lily!" we shouted, but there was no response. Then, we wandered lost in the forest until dawn. There were sounds everywhere, movement all around us, but we couldn't see anyone. Only screams and mysterious noises came from the depths of the forest. As the day began to break, we stumbled upon a path and decided to follow it. Eventually, we made it back to the town, but we still hadn't found Lily. We reported the situation to the police, but they couldn't find anything. Lily was gone. A week later, another group camping in the same forest went missing. The police started investigating again, but there was something in that forest. The forest didn't seem to want to give anyone back. Everything had disappeared, but something remained. After that day, people in the town began to talk about the whispers they heard in the forest at night. Some couldn't sleep until morning, feeling as though something was watching them. A week later, a man stood in the town square and said, "Anyone who spends the night in the depths of the forest loses something. But that thing will come back. The night is the forest's call. It takes someone and doesn't return them." And from that day on, no one in the town dared to spend the night in that forest again.